Hey guys, tonight we delve into something a little different. The perfumed, silk-draped world of royal courts, where power and passion collided in the most spectacular ways imaginable. This wasn't the sanitized history you learned in school, all proper portraits and diplomatic marriages. This was the world of secret letters, midnight rendezvous, and scandals that toppled kingdoms. A place where love, lust, and politics created a cocktail so intoxicating it could destroy empires with a single whisper. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe pour yourself a glass of wine for that authentic royal court atmosphere. And let's ease into tonight's journey through the most scandalous royal affairs in history. You're standing in the shadows of a marble corridor, the kind that echoes with centuries of whispered secrets. The air is thick with the scent of roses and something else, something dangerous. Politics, perhaps. Or maybe that's just the smell of a kingdom on the verge of collapse because its queen can't keep her hands off the wrong man. Welcome to the world of royal affairs, where love letters could start wars and a misplaced kiss could topple dynasties. Picture this. You're a courtier in 16th century France, and you've just witnessed something that could get you executed simply for seeing it. The queen is slipping a folded piece of parchment into the hands of a man who is decidedly not the king. The exchange lasts less than 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds contain enough scandal to fuel gossip for decades. You pretend to study a tapestry depicting some long-dead saint, but your ears are burning with the knowledge that you've just witnessed history in the making. The kind of history that doesn't make it into official chronicles but shapes the fate of nations nonetheless. The corridors of power have always been slippery with more than just political intrigue. They've been soaked in passion, drenched in desire, and occasionally, literally stained with blood. Because when you mix absolute power with human nature, what you get isn't a fairy tale. What you get is a soap opera written in golden ink and sealed with royal blood. Let's start with perhaps the most infamous royal affair in English history, one that literally rewrote the religious map of Europe and sent shockwaves through Christendom that are still reverberating today. Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Now, you might think you know this story, but the textbooks barely scratch the surface of just how scandalous, how utterly explosive this affair really was. Picture England in 1526. Henry VIII has been married to Catherine of Aragon for 17 years. She's a princess of Spain, daughter of the legendary Isabella and Ferdinand, the Catholic monarchs who expelled the Moors and funded Columbus. Catherine is pious, dignified, and politically valuable. She's also, in Henry's increasingly desperate opinion, cursed. After multiple pregnancies, she's given him one surviving child, Mary, and Henry needs a son. Not wants, needs. Because in Tudor England, a kingdom without a male heir is a kingdom on the brink of civil war. Enter Anne Boleyn. She's not a conventional beauty by the standards of her time. She's dark-haired in an era that prizes blonde locks. She's got a slight extra fingernail that her enemies will later call a mark of witchcraft, and she's sharp-tongued in a court that expects women to be silent ornaments. But Anne has something far more dangerous than conventional beauty. She has intelligence, ambition, and the kind of sexual magnetism that can make kings forget they're supposed to be ruling kingdoms. Anne had spent years at the French court, learning the art of courtly love, the delicate dance of attraction without consummation that kept powerful men enthralled for years. She'd watched as noble ladies wielded their sexuality like weapons, granting favors and withdrawing them with calculated precision. When she returned to England, she was armed with knowledge that would prove more powerful than any army. Henry's pursuit of Anne began as a typical royal dalliance. A few poems, some expensive gifts, maybe a secret meeting or two. But Anne had learned from watching her sister Mary, who had been Henry's mistress and was then discarded without ceremony when he grew bored. Anne would not make the same mistake. When Henry came calling, Anne said no. Not tonight, not ever, unless he could offer her something more permanent than a role in the royal bed. What followed was one of the most extraordinary courtships in royal history. Henry wrote letter after letter, each more desperate than the last. These weren't polite royal missives dictated to secretaries. These were raw, passionate outpourings of a man completely undone by desire. In one letter, he writes to her of his great agony, begging her to let him know expressly your whole mind as to the love between us. In another, he signs himself as her servant, a phrase that would have been shocking coming from a man who believed himself appointed by God to rule. But Anne held firm. Marriage or nothing. And for marriage to happen, Henry would need to annul his union with Catherine. This is where the scandal truly begins, because annulling a royal marriage wasn't just a personal matter. It was a diplomatic crisis, a religious upheaval, and a constitutional nightmare all rolled into one. Henry's first strategy was to argue that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid in the first place. Catherine had briefly been married to Henry's older brother Arthur before Arthur's death. The Bible, Henry's scholars argued, clearly stated that a man shouldn't marry his brother's wife. Never mind that the Pope had issued a special dispensation allowing the marriage in the first place. Never mind that Catherine swore her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. Henry needed his annulment, and he was prepared to rewrite theology to get it. What followed was 6 years of legal, political, and religious warfare that tore England apart. The Pope, caught between Henry's demands and pressure from Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, refused to grant the annulment. Henry's chancellor, Cardinal Wolsey, found himself caught in an impossible position and ultimately fell from grace so spectacularly that it inspired Shakespeare to write about it centuries later. Meanwhile, the affair itself was becoming increasingly public and increasingly scandalous. Henry and Anne were spotted together constantly. She had her own apartments at court, her own retinue of servants, and influence over political appointments that normally belonged only to queens. Courtiers who had spent decades navigating the delicate politics of Catherine's court suddenly found themselves having to curry favor with a woman who technically had no official status whatsoever. The sexual tension was palpable, and, for a court accustomed to royal restraint, utterly shocking. Anne would publicly rebuke Henry when he displeased her. She would withdraw from court functions, leaving him visibly distraught. Their fights were legendary, their reconciliations even more so. This wasn't the distant, formal relationship that royal marriages typically involved. This was raw passion, played out on the most public stage in Europe. The international ramifications were staggering. Catherine's nephew, Charles V, was the most powerful man in Europe, controlling Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, and much of Italy. He took Henry's treatment of his aunt as a personal insult and a political threat. France, England's traditional enemy, suddenly became a potential ally as Henry sought support for his annulment. The Pope found himself playing a delicate game, trying to avoid taking sides in a dispute that could reshape the balance of European power. But the most shocking development was yet to come. In 1533, Henry married Anne in secret, despite the fact that his marriage to Catherine had still not been officially annulled. Anne was already pregnant, and Henry couldn't risk the legitimacy of their child being questioned. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who owed his position to Henry's favor, quietly declared Henry's first marriage invalid and his second marriage legitimate. Just like that, with a few strokes of a pen, England had a new queen and a new religious direction. The coronation of Anne Boleyn was one of the most controversial royal ceremonies in English history. Half the nobility refused to attend. The common people, who had loved Catherine for her piety and charity, watched in stony silence as Anne processed through London. There were no cheers, no celebrations, just the sullen acceptance of a nation that knew it was witnessing something unprecedented and potentially catastrophic. But the scandal was far from over. Anne's reign as queen was turbulent from the beginning. She gave Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, not the son he desperately needed. She miscarried multiple times, each failure increasing Henry's doubts about whether God approved of their union. Her sharp tongue and political interference made her enemies at court, enemies who whispered that she had bewitched the king through dark arts. The end came with shocking swiftness. In 1536, just 3 years after her coronation, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The evidence was flimsy at best, clearly fabricated to give Henry the legal pretext he needed to rid himself of a wife who had failed to give him sons. But the charges themselves tell us something about the nature of the scandal that had gripped England for nearly a decade. Anne was accused of having affairs with 5 different men, including her own brother. Whether these charges were true is almost irrelevant. What mattered was that they were believable to a court that had watched Anne and Henry's passionate, tempestuous relationship play out for years. Anne's trial was a foregone conclusion. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. On May 19, 1536, she was beheaded by a French swordsman, an expert imported specifically for the occasion because Henry wanted her death to be quick and clean. Her last words were a protestation of innocence and loyalty to the king who had destroyed his kingdom's relationship with Rome for love of her. The aftermath of Anne Boleyn's affair reverberated through English history for centuries. Henry's break with Rome led to the establishment of the Church of England, with the monarch as its head. This religious revolution would shape English politics, culture, and international relations for generations. The daughter Anne bore, Elizabeth I, would become one of England's greatest monarchs, ruling for 45 years, and establishing England as a major European power. But she would also remain unmarried her entire life, perhaps having learned from her mother's fate the dangers that awaited royal women who let passion override politics. But Henry VIII's affair with Anne Boleyn, earth-shattering as it was, represents just one variety of royal scandal. Sometimes the most explosive affairs were those that remained secret, festering in the shadows until they burst into the light with devastating consequences. Consider the case of Marie Antoinette and Count Axel von Fersen, a scandal that helped fuel the French Revolution and ultimately led to the fall of the French monarchy. Unlike Henry and Anne's very public courtship, this affair was conducted in whispers, glances, and coded letters that historians are still debating today. Marie Antoinette arrived in France in 1770 as a 14-year-old Austrian princess, married off to the future Louis XVI to cement an alliance between France and Austria. From the beginning, she was viewed with suspicion by the French court and people. She was Austrian in a country that had been fighting Austria for centuries. She was young and frivolous in a court that prized sophistication. And most damaging of all, she was blamed for her husband's sexual dysfunction, which delayed the consummation of their marriage for 7 years. Into this tense situation walked Count Axel von Fersen, a Swedish nobleman who was everything Louis XVI was not. Where Louis was awkward and indecisive, Fersen was charming and confident. Where Louis was physically clumsy, Fersen was graceful and athletic. Where Louis seemed uncomfortable with the ceremonies and etiquette of court life, Fersen navigated them with easy elegance. Fersen first met Marie Antoinette at a masquerade ball in 1774, when she was still the Dauphine. According to court gossips, who watched every royal interaction with the intensity of professional spies, there was an immediate chemistry between them. They danced together several times, an unusual breach of protocol that was noted and whispered about for weeks afterward. What made this affair so scandalous wasn't just the obvious attraction between the Queen and the Swedish Count, it was the timing and the political implications. France in the 1780s was teetering on the edge of financial and social collapse. The American Revolution had drained the royal treasury. Bad harvests had left the common people hungry and angry. The nobility and clergy refused to pay taxes while peasants starved. In this powder keg of resentment, the Queen's perceived frivolity and foreign loyalties made her a perfect target for popular hatred. The affair, if it was indeed a physical affair, and not just an intense emotional connection, was conducted with a discretion that would have impressed professional spies. Fersen had apartments in the palace, but he also maintained secret lodgings in Paris where he and the Queen could meet away from the watching eyes of the court. They developed an elaborate code for their correspondence, referring to each other by numbers and using innocent-seeming phrases to discuss their meetings. But in the hothouse atmosphere of Versailles, no secret remained hidden for long. Servants talked, courtiers speculated, political enemies gathered evidence. By the mid-1780s, pamphlets circulating in Paris openly accused the Queen of adultery with various men, including Fersen. These libelles, as they were called, described in graphic detail the Queen's supposed sexual adventures. They depicted her as a woman so consumed by lust that she was willing to betray her husband, her children, and her adopted country. The political ramifications were catastrophic. Marie Antoinette's reputation was so damaged that when the monarchy faced its final crisis during the Revolution, the French people felt no sympathy for her plight. She was seen not as a tragic figure caught up in historical forces beyond her control, but as a foreign agent who had corrupted the monarchy from within. The fact that she was Austrian made her suspected of secretly working for France's enemies. Her close relationship with Fersen, who had served in the American Revolution and maintained connections across Europe, seemed to confirm these suspicions. When the royal family attempted to flee France in 1791, it was Fersen who organized their escape. The plan was elaborate and initially successful. Disguised as servants, the king, queen, and their children left Paris under cover of darkness, heading for the Austrian border where the queen's brother could provide protection. But the escape was bungled. The royal family was recognized and arrested at Varennes, and their attempt to flee was seen as the ultimate proof of their treason against the French nation. The role of Fersen in this escape attempt was quickly discovered, and it seemed to confirm every rumor about his relationship with the Queen. Here was proof that Marie Antoinette had been willing to put her personal relationships above her duties to France. The woman, who had once been criticized for spending too much on jewelry and parties, was now accused of collaborating with foreign enemies to destroy the revolution and restore absolute monarchy. The end came with the brutal efficiency that characterized the revolution's treatment of perceived enemies. Louis XVI was executed in January 1793. Marie Antoinette followed him to the guillotine 9 months later, after a trial that was more political theater than legal proceeding. As she climbed the scaffold, the crowd that had once bowed to her shouted insults and accusations. Among them were references to her Swedish lover, the foreign count who had supposedly corrupted her body and soul. Fersen survived the revolution but never recovered from Marie Antoinette's death. He kept her letters and portraits for the rest of his life, returning again and again to the coded language they had used to express their love. In 1810, ironically, he was killed by a Swedish mob who suspected him of poisoning the heir to the Swedish throne. Even in death, he couldn't escape the political violence that had defined his relationship with the doomed Queen of France. The affair between Marie Antoinette and Fersen demonstrates how royal scandals could become political weapons. Whether or not the Queen actually committed adultery was less important than the perception that she had betrayed her marriage vows, and, by extension, her vows to the French people. In an age when royal legitimacy depended on moral authority as much as political power, sexual scandal could be more destructive than military defeat. But not all royal affairs ended in tragedy. Some, paradoxically, strengthened the very institutions they seemed to threaten. The relationship between Catherine the Great and Grigory Potemkin represents one of history's most successful combinations of political alliance and passionate romance. Catherine II came to power in Russia through a palace coup that overthrew her own husband, Peter III, in 1762. From the beginning of her reign, she faced the challenge of legitimizing her rule in a country that had never accepted female sovereignty easily. She was German-born in a nation suspicious of foreign influence. She had seized power through force in a culture that valued legal succession, and she ruled an empire stretching from Poland to the Pacific, filled with noble families who remembered when their ancestors had been independent princes. Into this volatile situation came Grigory Potemkin, a one-eyed former guards officer who combined military brilliance with theatrical flair and sexual magnetism. Their first meeting, according to court legend, occurred during the coup that brought Catherine to power. Potemkin was among the officers who supported her claim to the throne, and Catherine noticed him immediately. He was tall, commanding, and had the kind of intense charisma that could fill a room. Their affair began in 1774 and lasted in various forms for the rest of their lives. What made it scandalous wasn't just the obvious passion between them, though contemporaries noted that Catherine, normally composed and calculating, seemed to lose all restraint around Potemkin. The scandal was that Catherine made no attempt to hide their relationship and, even more shocking, she allowed Potemkin to influence state policy in ways that no royal favorite had ever been permitted. Potemkin became Catherine's co-ruler in all but name. She created new titles for him: Governor General of New Russia, Grand Admiral of the Black Sea Fleet, Prince of Taurus. But these weren't empty honors designed to flatter a royal lover. Catherine gave Potemkin real power over vast territories and crucial military campaigns. Together, they planned and executed the conquest of Crimea, the colonization of southern Russia, and the expansion of Russian power into the Ottoman Empire. Their correspondence, which survived because both of them were compulsive letter writers, reveals a relationship of extraordinary intimacy and trust. Catherine writes to Potemkin not just as a lover, but as a partner in ruling an empire. She consults him on everything from military strategy to court appointments to foreign policy. In one letter, she calls him "my friend," "my beloved," "my husband." In another, she signs herself "your tender friend," and adds, "I am yours to command." But the most scandalous aspect of their relationship was the rumor, never confirmed but widely believed, that Catherine and Potemkin had secretly married. This would have been a stunning breach of royal protocol. Russian empresses were expected to marry other royalty, or at least high nobility from established European dynasties. Marriage to a Russian subject, no matter how talented or powerful, was almost unthinkable. Yet the evidence for a secret marriage is compelling. Catherine and Potemkin referred to each other as husband and wife in their private letters. Court observers noted that their relationship had a settled domestic quality that went beyond mere physical attraction. Most tellingly, when Catherine began taking younger lovers in the 1780s, it was Potemkin who selected them, interviewed them, and oversaw their careers at court. This wasn't the behavior of a discarded former lover. It was the behavior of a husband secure enough in his wife's affections to manage her extramarital dalliances. The political implications of Catherine and Potemkin's relationship were enormous. Here was an empress who had flouted every convention about royal romance, and, instead of weakening her position, had actually strengthened it. Potemkin's military successes became Catherine's triumphs. His administrative reforms became evidence of her enlightened rule. Their partnership transformed Russia from a relatively backward European power into an empire that rivaled France and Britain in wealth and influence. When Potemkin died in 1791, Catherine's grief was so profound that courtiers feared for her sanity. She locked herself in her rooms for days, refusing to see anyone or conduct state business. When she finally emerged, she had aged visibly, and those who knew her well said she never fully recovered from the loss. She had lost not just a lover but her partner in power, the one person who truly understood both her personal needs and her imperial ambitions. Catherine's affair with Potemkin succeeded where so many other royal romances failed, because both partners understood that their personal relationship served larger political purposes. They weren't just lovers, but allies in the complicated business of ruling an empire. Their scandal became a strength because it demonstrated Catherine's ability to choose effective partners and to inspire intense loyalty in talented subordinates. Moving from the frozen palaces of St. Petersburg to the sun-baked terraces of ancient Rome, we encounter perhaps the most politically destructive affair in classical history: the relationship between Cleopatra VII of Egypt and Mark Antony. This wasn't just a scandal that titillated gossips and moralists. It was a geopolitical catastrophe that ended the Roman Republic and established the template for imperial autocracy that would dominate European politics for the next 15 centuries. Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of Egypt, heir to a dynasty that had ruled the Nile for 3 centuries since Alexander the Great's conquest. But by the 1st century BCE, Egypt was a client state of Rome, its wealth crucial to feeding the Roman mob and financing Roman armies. Cleopatra's hold on power depended entirely on maintaining good relations with whoever controlled Roman policy. The problem was that Rome in the 40s and 30s BCE was convulsed by civil war. Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus had formed an unofficial triumvirate to control the state, but their alliance collapsed in jealousy and ambition. Caesar emerged victorious, but his assassination in 44 BCE plunged Rome back into chaos. The ultimate struggle was between Caesar's heir Octavian and Caesar's lieutenant Mark Antony, with the winner destined to become master of the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra had already had an affair with Julius Caesar, bearing him a son and living openly as his mistress during her time in Rome. That relationship had been scandalous enough, particularly since Caesar was married to Calpurnia, and his political enemies could use his Egyptian liaison to question his loyalty to Roman values. But Caesar was too powerful and too popular for such criticism to damage him seriously. Mark Antony was in a more precarious position. As one of 3 men competing for control of the Roman world, he couldn't afford any scandal that might undermine his claim to represent traditional Roman virtues. His affair with Cleopatra, which began in 41 BCE when she sailed to meet him at Tarsus, was therefore politically suicidal from the beginning. The meeting at Tarsus was itself a masterpiece of political theater that became a scandal throughout the ancient world. Cleopatra arrived dressed as Aphrodite, goddess of love, sailing in a barge with golden oars and purple sails. The air was heavy with the scent of perfume, and her servants were dressed as cupids. It was a display designed to overwhelm the senses and announced that here was a woman who commanded not just political power, but erotic authority that could rival the gods themselves. Antony was completely captivated. He abandoned his military campaigns and spent the winter in Alexandria, living in luxury, while his enemies in Rome spread stories about his moral corruption. The propaganda war that followed was vicious even by Roman standards. Octavian's supporters portrayed Antony as a man so besotted with foreign sensuality that he had forgotten his duties as a Roman. They claimed he had adopted Egyptian dress, Egyptian customs, even Egyptian religious practices. Most damaging of all, they suggested that he intended to make Cleopatra not just his mistress, but his co-ruler, turning the Roman Empire into an Oriental despotism. The sexual dimension of these attacks was particularly vicious. Roman propaganda depicted Cleopatra as a woman of insatiable appetites who had corrupted Antony through what they called Egyptian vices. She was described as a sorceress who had bewitched the Roman general with drugs and dark magic. These weren't just personal insults, but political arguments. In Roman culture, sexual self-control was seen as fundamental to political virtue. A man who couldn't govern his own desires couldn't be trusted to govern an empire. The affair became even more scandalous when Antony formally divorced his Roman wife, Octavia, who happened to be Octavian's sister, and married Cleopatra in a ceremony that Romans refused to recognize as legal. This wasn't just personal betrayal, but political declaration. Antony was announcing that his loyalties lay not with Rome, but with Egypt. Not with his Roman family, but with his foreign queen. The propaganda war escalated into actual warfare when Octavian declared war not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra, cleverly framing the conflict as a struggle between Roman virtue and foreign corruption. The decisive battle came at Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian's fleet defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. According to Octavian's historians, Cleopatra fled in the middle of the battle, and Antony abandoned his men to follow her. Whether this account is accurate or simply victorious propaganda, it became the accepted version of events. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria, where they committed suicide rather than face capture and humiliation in Rome. Their deaths marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, and the beginning of the Roman Empire under Octavian, who took the name Augustus. But the scandal of their affair lived on in Roman literature and law. Augustus used their relationship as justification for moral legislation designed to strengthen traditional Roman marriage and family structures. Poets like Virgil and Horace wrote works that portrayed Cleopatra as the embodiment of Eastern excess and moral corruption, a warning about what happened when Roman virtue was contaminated by foreign influence. The affair between Antony and Cleopatra demonstrates how royal scandals could reshape the ancient world. Their relationship didn't just destroy 2 lives, but ended the Roman Republic and established the imperial system that would dominate European politics for centuries. It showed how sexual politics and international relations could become fatally intertwined, how personal passion could become a political weapon, and how the bedroom could become a battlefield that determined the fate of empires. But sometimes royal affairs were scandalous, not because of their political consequences, but because of their sheer audacity in defying social conventions. The relationship between Queen Christina of Sweden and Countess Ebba Spera represents one of the most intriguing same-sex royal romances in European history, made all the more remarkable by occurring in the 17th century, when such relationships were not just scandalous but potentially fatal. Christina became Queen of Sweden at age 6 when her father Gustav II Adolf was killed in the 30 Years' War. She was raised almost as a boy, given the classical education typically reserved for male heirs, and trained in the martial arts that Swedish nobility considered essential. By the time she reached adulthood, Christina had developed into one of the most intellectually formidable monarchs in European history, fluent in multiple languages, well-versed in philosophy and theology, and capable of holding her own in political debates with the most seasoned diplomats. But Christina's greatest scandal wasn't intellectual, but emotional. Her relationship with Countess Ebba Speer, one of her ladies-in-waiting, was conducted with an openness that shocked the Swedish court and fascinated observers across Europe. They were inseparable, sharing not just daily activities but intimate conversations and affectionate gestures that went far beyond normal friendship between noblewomen. Their letters, which survive in fragmentary form, reveal a relationship of extraordinary intensity. Christina writes to Ebba with the passionate language typically reserved for romantic lovers, calling her my soul, my heart, and my life. In one letter, she writes, "I cannot live without you. You are more necessary to me than breath itself." These weren't the formal exchanges between royal mistress and servant, but the outpourings of a woman deeply, desperately in love. What made their relationship particularly scandalous was Christina's absolute refusal to conform to royal expectations about marriage and succession. Every major European power sought alliance with Sweden through marriage to its young queen. Proposals came from France, Spain, Austria, Poland, and various German states. Christina rejected them all, often with a bluntness that bordered on insult. When pressed by her council to explain her refusal to marry, she declared that she was born free and intended to remain so, that marriage was a form of slavery she would never accept. This declaration was shocking enough in an age when royal marriages were diplomatic necessities rather than personal choices. But Christina's obvious preference for Ebba's company over any male suitor made her motives clear to anyone willing to see. Court observers noted that the queen seemed to come alive only in Ebba's presence, that her famous wit and intellectual curiosity were most brilliant when she was conversing with her favorite. The political implications were severe. Sweden, in the 17th century, was a major European power, controlling much of the Baltic and playing a crucial role in the balance between Catholic and Protestant forces. Christina's refusal to marry meant that the direct line of succession would end with her death, potentially throwing the kingdom into civil war or foreign intervention. Her council pleaded with her to do her duty to the state. Foreign ambassadors offered increasingly generous terms for marriage alliances. Christina remained unmoved. The scandal reached its climax in 1654, when Christina abdicated the throne at age 27, officially because she had converted to Catholicism and couldn't remain queen of a Protestant nation. But court insiders knew the real reason. Christina chose love over duty, personal happiness over political obligation. She couldn't marry a man while being in love with a woman, and she couldn't remain queen without marrying and producing heirs. After her abdication, Christina traveled to Rome, where she lived openly as a Catholic convert and patron of the arts. Ebba remained in Sweden, married to a nobleman chosen by her family. Their separation was permanent and, by all accounts, devastating to both women. Christina never married, never took another lover who captured the historical record, and spent the rest of her long life in what appears to have been profound loneliness. The affair between Christina and Ebba was scandalous not just because it was between two women, but because it demonstrated the impossible choices faced by royal women who refused to subordinate personal desire to political necessity. Christina's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing emotion to override duty, but it also represented something unprecedented in royal history. A monarch who chose authenticity over authority, love over legacy. Moving forward several centuries to the Victorian era, we encounter a different type of royal scandal in the relationship between Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, and later King Edward VII and the actress Lily Langtry. This affair was scandalous, not because it threatened political stability, but because it violated the strict moral codes that defined respectable society in late 19th century Britain. Edward was the eldest son of Queen Victoria, heir to the British throne, and symbol of imperial virtue and Protestant morality. His affair with Lily Langtry, which began in 1877, represented everything the Victorian establishment claimed to despise about modern decadence and moral relativism. Langtry was an actress, a profession barely considered respectable for women. She was married, but separated from her husband. Most shocking of all, she was a professional beauty, a woman who traded on her physical appearance for social advancement and financial gain. Their relationship began when Langtry was performing in London's West End, already famous as one of the most beautiful women in England. Her portraits, by fashionable painters, hung in gallery windows where crowds gathered to admire them. She had transformed her beauty into a career, endorsing products, allowing her image to be used in advertisements, and charging fees for public appearances. This commercialization of feminine appeal was deeply troubling to Victorian sensibilities. Edward's pursuit of Langtry was conducted with a recklessness that horrified his mother and her advisors. He attended her performances night after night, often in full view of other theater-goers who recognized him despite his attempts at discretion. He sent her expensive gifts, flowers, jewelry, and eventually a house where they could meet privately. Most scandalously, he appeared with her at public events, restaurants, race meetings, and society gatherings where her presence made his infatuation obvious to anyone who cared to look. The affair was reported in detail by the growing popular press, which had discovered that royal scandals sold newspapers better than political news. For the first time in British history, the private life of a royal heir was dissected in print for mass consumption. Magazines published illustrations of Edward and Langtry together. Gossip columns speculated about their relationship. Society newspapers reported their public appearances with the breathless excitement of modern celebrity journalism. What made this coverage particularly damaging was the contrast it drew between Edward's behavior and the moral standards his mother claimed to represent. Queen Victoria had built her reign on the image of royal respectability, the idea that the monarchy embodied the highest standards of personal virtue and family values. Edward's very public affair with an actress directly contradicted this image and suggested that royal privilege extended to exemption from the moral laws that governed ordinary subjects. The scandal intensified when Langtry became pregnant. While the child's paternity was never officially acknowledged, everyone assumed Edward was the father. This wasn't just personal embarrassment, but constitutional crisis. If Edward had acknowledged the child, questions would have arisen about succession rights and the legitimacy of his future heirs by his wife, Princess Alexandra of Denmark. The resolution of the affair was as public as its conduct had been. Edward gradually withdrew his support from Langtry, transferring his attentions to other actresses and society beauties. Langtry, with characteristic entrepreneurial spirit, used her notoriety to launch a career as an international celebrity, touring America, where she was advertised as the Royal Beauty, and commanding enormous fees for theatrical performances that were more about her fame than her acting ability. The Edward and Langtry affair marked a turning point in royal scandal. It demonstrated how modern mass media could transform private indiscretions into public entertainment, how royal behavior that previous generations had hidden or ignored could become front-page news. The affair also showed how changing social attitudes toward sexuality and celebrity were creating new forms of scandal that traditional royal protocols couldn't contain. But perhaps the most psychologically complex royal affair in history was the relationship between King Ludwig II of Bavaria and his various male lovers. particularly his aide-de-camp, Richard Hornig, and the actor Joseph Kainz. Ludwig's scandals were devastating, not because they threatened political stability, but because they revealed the psychological torment of a man caught between royal duty and personal authenticity in an age that criminalized homosexuality. Ludwig became King of Bavaria in 1864 at age 18, inheriting a kingdom caught between the growing power of Prussia and the declining influence of Austria. He was expected to marry, produce heirs, and navigate the complex diplomacy of German unification. Instead, he became obsessed with art, architecture, and the creation of fantasy castles that drained the royal treasury and alarmed his ministers. From the beginning of his reign, Ludwig's behavior struck courtiers as unusual. He avoided state functions, preferring to spend his time with a small circle of male companions. He never showed romantic interest in women, despite pressure from his family to marry his cousin Sophie, sister of the Austrian Empress Elizabeth. When he finally became engaged to Sophie in 1867, the relationship was clearly forced and uncomfortable for both parties. Ludwig broke off the engagement before the wedding, claiming he needed more time to prepare for marriage. He would never again seriously consider marrying. Instead, Ludwig formed intense emotional attachments to young men who served in various capacities at court. The most significant was Richard Hornig, a stablemaster's son who became Ludwig's personal aide and constant companion. Their relationship lasted for years and was conducted with an intimacy that scandalized the Bavarian court. They traveled together, dined alone together, and shared living quarters in Ludwig's various castles. Hornig was given expensive gifts, noble titles, and influence over court appointments that far exceeded his official position. But the relationship that truly scandalized Europe was Ludwig's obsession with Joseph Kainz, a young Hungarian actor whom the king first saw performing in Munich in 1881. Ludwig was immediately captivated, not just by Kainz's talent, but by his dark, romantic beauty. What followed was one of the most intense courtships in royal history, conducted entirely through letters, gifts, and increasingly desperate attempts to win the actor's exclusive attention. Ludwig showered Kainz with presents that included jewelry, horses, and eventually an entire villa. He wrote letters that were passionate to the point of incoherence, expressing love with an intensity that terrified those who read them. In one letter, he writes to Kainz, "You are my everything, my sun, my moon, my stars. Without you, I am nothing but shadow and emptiness." In another, he declares, "I would give up my crown, my kingdom, my very life for one night in your arms." The scandal wasn't just that Ludwig was expressing homosexual desire, though that was certainly shocking enough in 19th century Bavaria. The real scandal was the way his passion undermined his ability to function as king. He abandoned state business to write letters to Kainz. He spent enormous sums of public money on gifts for his favorite. He planned elaborate entertainments and private performances that existed solely to provide opportunities to see the actor. When Kainz, who was heterosexual and uncomfortable with the king's attention, tried to distance himself from the relationship, Ludwig's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would summon the actor to court and then dismiss him without explanation. He would send contradictory messages, professing eternal love one day and royal displeasure the next. Court observers reported that the king seemed to be losing his grip on reality, talking to imaginary companions and issuing orders to servants who weren't there. The political implications were severe. Bavaria was a constitutional monarchy, where the king's mental stability was crucial to governmental function. Ludwig's ministers watched with growing alarm as their sovereign became increasingly disconnected from the practical business of ruling. His obsession with building fantasy castles like Neuschwanstein was draining the royal treasury. His refusal to marry meant no direct heirs to the throne. most seriously. His obvious homosexuality made him vulnerable to blackmail and political manipulation by those who knew his secrets. The end came in 1886, when a commission of psychiatrists, acting on the orders of Ludwig's own ministers, declared him mentally incompetent to rule. The diagnosis was based partly on his architectural extravagances and partly on reports of his sexual behavior, though the commissioners never actually examined Ludwig in person. He was deposed and confined to a lakeside castle where, 3 days later, he was found dead in the water along with his psychiatrist. Whether this was suicide, accident, or murder remains one of history's great mysteries. Ludwig's affairs were scandalous, not just because they violated sexual norms, but because they demonstrated the impossible position of royal men who couldn't or wouldn't conform to heterosexual expectations. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal desire to override royal duty, but it also revealed the psychological cost of forcing individuals to deny their authentic selves for political convenience. The 20th century brought new forms of royal scandal as mass media, changing social attitudes, and 2 world wars transformed the relationship between monarchies and their subjects. The most famous royal affair of the modern era, the relationship between King Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, combined traditional elements of royal scandal with distinctly modern concerns about divorce, American influence, and the role of monarchy in democratic society. Edward became Prince of Wales in 1910 and heir to the British throne, but from early adulthood he showed little enthusiasm for royal duty. He was charming, handsome, and popular with the public, but he chafed against the restrictions of royal protocol and made no secret of his preference for modern American culture over traditional British values. His affairs with married women were numerous and well known to society gossips, though the British press maintained a discreet silence about royal private life. Everything changed when Edward met Wallis Simpson in 1931. She was an American socialite, twice divorced, living in London with her second husband. By the standards of British high society, she was completely unsuitable as a royal companion. She was common-born, foreign, and most damaging of all, divorced. The Church of England, of which the king was supreme governor, did not recognize divorce and would not perform religious ceremonies for divorced persons. But Edward was completely captivated. Unlike his previous affairs, which had been casual and temporary, his relationship with Wallis deepened into what he claimed was the great love of his life. He pursued her with a single-minded intensity that alarmed his family and horrified government officials. By 1934, their affair was the subject of intense speculation in American and European newspapers, though the British press continued to maintain silence about the king's private life. The scandal reached crisis point when Edward succeeded to the throne as King Edward VIII in January 1936. Constitutional convention required that he marry and produce heirs to secure the succession. But Edward made it clear that he intended to marry Wallis Simpson, regardless of her divorce status or the constitutional implications. The British government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, informed the king that marriage to a divorced woman was impossible. The Church of England would not perform the ceremony. Parliament would not pass legislation to make it legal. The Dominion governments of Canada, Australia, and South Africa all opposed the marriage. Edward's response was to propose a morganatic marriage, where Wallis would become his wife, but not queen, and any children would not inherit the throne. This compromise was rejected by all parties. The British Constitution did not recognize morganatic marriage. More fundamentally, the idea that the king could marry a woman deemed unsuitable to be queen suggested that royal marriage was a private matter rather than a state institution. The crisis deepened when the American and European press began reporting that the king intended to abdicate rather than give up Wallis Simpson. For months, the British public had been kept in ignorance of their monarch's romantic entanglements. When the story finally broke in British newspapers in December 1936, it caused a sensation that paralyzed the government and divided public opinion. The abdication speech that Edward delivered on December 11, 1936, was one of the most extraordinary documents in royal history. Speaking directly to his subjects via radio, he explained that he could not carry out his duties as king without the support of the woman I love. The phrase became one of the most famous in 20th century history, transforming a constitutional crisis into a romantic tragedy that captured global imagination. But the aftermath of the abdication revealed the true scandal of Edward and Wallis's relationship. After their marriage in 1937, they became the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, living in exile and growing increasingly bitter about their treatment by the royal family. During World War II, disturbing evidence emerged of their sympathies for Nazi Germany. Edward had met with Adolf Hitler in 1937 and had made statements suggesting that Britain should seek accommodation with the Nazi regime. Intelligence reports suggested that the Germans considered Edward a potential puppet ruler if Britain could be conquered. The wartime scandal of the Windsors transformed their love story into something much darker. What had seemed like a romantic sacrifice of throne for love now appeared as potential treason motivated by personal resentment. The affair that had captivated the world in 1936 became, by 1940, a source of shame and embarrassment for the British royal family. The Edward and Wallis affair demonstrated how royal scandals in the modern era could combine personal drama with international politics in ways that previous centuries couldn't have imagined. Their relationship played out against the backdrop of rising fascism, world war, and the decline of traditional monarchy. It showed how individual royal choices could have global implications, and how love stories could become security risks. But the most enduring legacy of their affair was its impact on popular culture and media coverage of royalty. The abdication crisis was the first royal scandal to be covered live by radio and newsreels, creating a mass audience for royal drama that had never existed before. It established the template for modern celebrity culture, where public figures' private lives become entertainment for mass consumption. This media transformation reached its peak with the most recent great royal scandal, the relationship between Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, which dominated British tabloid coverage for decades and ultimately contributed to one of the most traumatic periods in modern royal history. Charles and Camilla first met in the early 1970s when both were young and unmarried. Their relationship was serious enough that many expected them to marry, but Camilla was considered unsuitable as a future queen due to her lack of aristocratic background and her relationship with Andrew Parker Bowles, whom she eventually married in 1973. Charles, under pressure to find a suitable bride, eventually married Lady Diana Spencer in 1981 in what was promoted as a fairy tale royal wedding. But the marriage was troubled from the beginning, partly due to the significant age difference between Charles and Diana, partly due to their incompatible personalities, and crucially due to Charles's continuing emotional attachment to Camilla Parker Bowles. The affair between Charles and Camilla resumed in the mid-1980s while both were married to other people. What made this scandal particularly devastating was its intersection with the media transformation of royal coverage. By the 1980s, the British tabloid press had discovered that royal stories sold newspapers better than any other content. Diana, young, beautiful, and photogenic, became the most famous woman in the world, followed constantly by photographers and reporters who documented her every public appearance. When the Charles and Diana marriage began to deteriorate publicly in the early 1990s, the tabloid coverage became increasingly intrusive and sensational. Stories about Charles's affair with Camilla were published alongside photographs of Diana looking isolated and unhappy. The contrast between the glamorous young princess and the older, less conventionally attractive other woman created a narrative of betrayal and victimization that gripped public attention worldwide. The scandal reached its peak in 1992 and 1993 with the publication of intimate telephone conversations between Charles and Camilla that had been illegally recorded. These Camillagate tapes revealed private moments of extraordinary intimacy and sexual frankness that shocked a public accustomed to royal discretion. The recordings were published in full by several newspapers, creating a level of public humiliation for royal figures that had never been seen before. The political implications were severe. Public opinion polls showed massive support for Diana and equally massive disapproval of Charles. Questions were raised about whether Charles was suitable to become king given his violation of his marriage vows and his obvious preference for a married woman over his young wife. The monarchy's approval ratings dropped to historic lows as the scandal dominated news coverage month after month. The tragic conclusion came with Diana's death in a Paris car crash in 1997 while being pursued by paparazzi photographers. The public grief that followed was partly genuine mourning for a beloved figure and partly an expression of anger at the royal family and media coverage that many blamed for Diana's death. Charles and Camilla's affair, which had seemed like a private matter between consenting adults, suddenly appeared to have contributed to a tragedy that shocked the world. The aftermath of Diana's death forced a fundamental reassessment of royal scandal and media coverage. Charles and Camilla continued their relationship, but were forced to conduct it with extreme discretion for several years. When they finally married in 2005, the ceremony was deliberately low-key, acknowledging that their affair had permanently damaged their public standing and complicated Camilla's position as future queen consort. The Charles and Camilla affair represents the culmination of centuries of royal scandal evolution. It combined traditional elements like adultery and marriage politics with modern factors like mass media coverage, public opinion polling, and global celebrity culture. It demonstrated how royal affairs in the media age could become international entertainment while maintaining their power to destabilize monarchical institutions. What makes royal affairs so enduringly fascinating is their combination of the universal and the exceptional. On one level, they're simply stories about human beings struggling with the same desires, conflicts, and emotional needs that affect everyone. Love, jealousy, sexual attraction, the need for intimacy and understanding. These are experiences that transcend historical periods and social classes. But royal affairs are also fundamentally different from ordinary relationships because they occur within structures of power that magnify every personal choice into a political statement. When kings and queens fall in love, their emotions become affairs of state. Their private letters become historical documents. Their bedroom choices can determine the fate of nations. This tension between the personal and the political is what gives royal scandals their unique power to captivate and disturb. They reveal the human cost of absolute power and the political consequences of human weakness. They show us what happens when individual desire collides with institutional necessity, when private truth conflicts with public duty. The great royal affairs also serve as mirrors reflecting the values, anxieties, and contradictions of their historical periods. Henry VIII's pursuit of Anne Boleyn revealed the fragility of religious authority in the face of political necessity. Marie Antoinette's relationship with Fersen reflected the growing nationalism that would ultimately destroy the old European order. Edward VIII's abdication demonstrated the declining power of traditional monarchy in democratic societies. These scandals endure in popular memory because they represent moments when history pivoted on personal choice, when the trajectory of civilizations was altered by individual human decisions about love, loyalty, and self-sacrifice. They remind us that behind the grand narratives of historical change are real people making impossible choices under extraordinary pressure. In our current age of mass media and global communication, royal scandals continue to evolve. The British royal family's recent struggles with issues of race, mental health, and media intrusion show how traditional monarchical institutions must adapt to contemporary social values while maintaining their essential character. The challenge for modern royalty is conducting private lives under constant public scrutiny while preserving enough dignity and mystery to justify their continued existence. But the fundamental dynamics of royal scandal remain unchanged. Power and passion will always create volatile combinations. Public figures will always struggle with the tension between authentic self-expression and institutional requirements. And audiences will always be fascinated by the spectacle of the mighty brought low by the same emotional forces that shape ordinary lives. The most scandalous royal affairs in history teach us that monarchy, for all its ceremony and tradition, is ultimately a human institution, vulnerable to the same weaknesses and strengths that define humanity itself. They show us that even those born to rule are subject to the universal laws of the heart, and that love and desire remain the most powerful forces in human experience, capable of toppling thrones and reshaping the world. In the end, these stories endure not because they're about kings and queens, but because they're about people. People who happen to wear crowns and command armies. People whose private struggles became public dramas. People who discovered that even unlimited power cannot protect against the vulnerabilities that make us human. Their scandals are our scandals, writ large on the stage of history, reminding us that passion and politics will always be dangerous companions, and that the heart remains the most ungovernable territory in any kingdom.